So my name is Ivan. I'm a recent graduate. I just graduated this semester from the University of Oklahoma. I was studying psychology and neuroscience, and then I'm an incoming master's student at John Hopkins with a focus in neuroscience as well.
Mm.
And yeah, my interests, I suppose my career interests would sort of center on the intersection between law and neuroscience. So I plan to pursue law school and then hopefully get a PhD in neuroscience as well to sort of mesh the two together. As of now, I'm aiming on going into academia. That seems to be the best way to sort of synthesize those two interests. But we'll see what happens down the line.
Yeah, that would actually lead me to my first question. What do you think is the difference between an independent researcher, for example, or a person who goes through the academic route? What are the benefits you could actually see from going to the academic route or being an independent researcher, for instance? So why did you actually choose to go through the academic route? I guess that's the question.
Yeah. Well, I suppose from a career standpoint, I think the answer's pretty clear, right? The sort of the degrees are obviously a sort of proof of concept, I suppose, right? If you say you have certain skills, you say you have certain skills, and the degree sort of, in theory, is supposed to back that, as well as knowledge. And then again, but I guess if we're speaking more sort of when it comes to knowledge, I think the internet is so vast now to the point where there are certain disciplines where you can amass a sort of you can develop a pretty profound understanding of a specific discipline or field. For example, philosophy. I know there are a ton of people on the internet who don't have any formal philosophy training, but as far as getting a degree or anything of the sort, but they're still they have. I would say that they have mastery over the field to a certain extent. Now, when it comes to academia, I would say that the benefits are quite large. Again, I think a lot of it comes down to the community that you're around, right? So if you're acquiring a PhD in, I don't know, chemistry, you're going to be around a lot of, very intelligent people who are also have a deep understanding of chemistry, and you're going to be able to sort of engage into these sort of higher order dialectics, I suppose, with respect to your field. And then also the requirements. So it almost sort of, it necessitates this sort of profound knowledge and skill out of you. If you're acquiring, at least as far as PhDs are concerned, right, you need to be an expert already. You need to have sufficient research experience. Research is also a big one. If you're in a field that requires research, like I said, philosophy doesn't. There is experimental philosophy, but generally speaking, there isn't a sort of, you're not running, you're not hypothesis testing or running sort of experiments in philosophy. But for chemistry, for instance, this is very, very complex research. And it allows you to sort of work in labs, acquire these certain lab skills, I suppose. So I would say, perhaps I'm just biased, I think the academic route is the ideal path. However, I do think it depends on your field. Again, if you're in the hard sciences, it's incredibly difficult to be a physicist if you don't go through the academic route and actually work in physics labs and acquire a deep mastery in physics. And then the academic route also sort of necessitates the sort of work ethic out of you, right? You have exams, you have these sort of, again, if you're in a graduate program, you have a thesis or a dissertation. So it sort of necessitates you to develop these skills and develop this knowledge before you can go out into the industry or before you can go out into academia. So I think, but again, as far as sort of independent thinkers go, I think there's quite a bit of benefit there. You have a lot of freedom. There aren't these sort of constraints placed upon you with respect to sort of where you can venture off and what you want to sort of delve into. Because once you're in academia, once you're fixated on the path, you're sort of fixated on that path. You can transition, but there's often a lot of sort of hurdles you have to sort of re-jump over, I suppose, right? If you're going, if you're going to economics and you're on your way to a PhD, and then you decide, well, I prefer, I don't know, sociology instead. Well, now you're going to have to sort of build your way back up in order to what would the word be? Sort of build up a repertoire, I suppose, where you can sort of go either work as a sociologist or get into a graduate program in sociology. You're going to have to sort of not start over, but you're going to have to build your way back up.
Yep. Yeah, so it's going to be like.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was about to say that I guess my way through this research, I guess, journey is to, I guess, simulate academia through the internet to a certain extent. So first I was trying to think like, okay, so I'm interested in a lot of different things. What's the perfect route for myself? I guess academia was one part of it, but then I thought that, okay, so if I share my thoughts on the internet, I can probably simulate some kind of academia, as you said, the community part of it. So the internet actually gravitates a lot of people towards you, or I guess like-minded people. So it's almost similar to academia to a certain extent. So that was my philosophy when it comes to the internet, I guess. I was trying to simulate this idea of, gravitating a lot of like-minded people, I guess, to debate and talk and just find interesting ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but that's actually very interesting. But just to be clear, you actually graduated from the University of Oklahoma from your undergraduate recently, or your graduate?
Graduate.
So you're
undergrad. Now I'm going to get my master's.
Okay, nice. Master's in psychology or
neuroscience.
Neuroscience, nice. So I guess, what's your point of view when it comes to the reduction of the mind through? I guess we can dive into the neuroscience a little bit, because I'm also interested in that. So what's your conception when it comes to reduction of the mind processes to neuroscience only? So I guess a lot of scientists have this reductive point of view where they think that the mind processes could eventually be explained through neuroscience, I guess. So do you take this conception, or do you think there's a lot of, I guess, empty or a lot of missing pieces when it comes to reductionism through neuroscience? Or do you think that we can eventually describe all mind processes through neuroscience, let's say?
Yeah, that's a good one. I used to be a hardcore reduction, or I used to be like a hardcore sort of, I suppose, I used to take the sort of metaphysical route, as in, the mind is a sort of separate entity. We have the sort of, I was a bit interested in the sort of duality between the mind-body distinction, right? The brain is separate from the mind. But I mean, recently I've become a bit of a reductionist myself. I do believe that we will be able to sort of explain sort of cognitive processes and these sort of mental states through neuroscience. I do think consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. I don't know. It's a very difficult question, because then you have things like, okay, what about, when we have, memories, right? Those sort of, these are immaterial. These are immaterial, and they're being generated through material substance. And so it's very interesting. And then again, you have these sort of thoughts as well. Thoughts are immaterial. They're abstract, but they're nonetheless being generated as a consequence of physical processes. So how does that work, right? I don't know. I think it's really interesting, but I do think that eventually we'll be able to sort of explain all cognitive processes through neuroscience. Though I do have great sympathy for the sort of mind body people out there who sort of invoke this sort of metaphysical presence with respect to sort of cognitive processes. So that's my take. It's not a very nuanced take, but I do believe that we will be able to explain the mind through neuroscience eventually. I think we're a long ways away, but you see a lot of people sort of state that this will be the sort of next Darwin, or the sort of next process like evolution, and then we had general relativity. A lot of people state that that'll be the sort of next big scientific discovery, right? Consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. So I don't know. I found myself, I don't know, perhaps it's just what happens when you go down. There's a saying I enjoy quite a bit, that the first glimpse or the first drink of the natural sciences will turn you to an atheist, but at the bottom, God is waiting for you.
I read that
quote,
actually.
That quote it's really interesting, and I think it's really pretty profound. So I think as of now, while I'm still sort of not even haven't even begun my career, but in these sort of early stages, I found myself to be quite a reductionist. So because if you don't grant, I mean, if you take the naturalistic route, you lose a lot of sort of these sort of
interesting phenomena,
right?
I guess.
These sort of metaphysical properties, right? You lose, because again, if you grant the naturalistic worldview, you lose love, you lose beauty, you lose morality, you lose all of these things, and they just sort of become comforts or sort of rationalizations, right? So I don't know. That's the sort of bullet I suppose I have to bite, and every naturalist has to bite when they sort of grant a naturalistic worldview. But a bit of a digression there. But yes, I
Yeah,
do.
no, no, no. That's actually very relevant. And the way I think about it is that, okay, so naturalism is, I think about it as internally consistent. I don't think there is something inherently, or although I don't agree with naturalism as a philosophical approach, but I think it's internally consistent, but it doesn't explain a lot of things, as you
Absolutely.
mentioned. So you cannot really find contradictions within it. But as soon as you look at the explanatory scope of this specific philosophical approach, you start to get into trouble. Like you reduce love, you reduce morality, and all
Absolutely.
these kind of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And these are things that sort of just, I suppose they're sort of intellectual seemings. I suppose like they appear to be true. It appears to be the case that love is more than just these sort of chemical processes in the brain. It
Yeah.
appears to be the case that beauty is more than just sort of, sort of, I don't know, pleasant, response to stimuli or symmetrical stimuli. It appears to be the case that, we have these sort of deep moral intuitions, right? I believe it was Kant that said that two things that amaze him were the stars in the sky and then the moral law within, right? I mean, it's just, it appears to be the case that these things have a metaphysical presence, and they're not just these sort of, I don't know, that they can't just be reduced to these physical processes. But I don't know. I'm also an anti-realist though, so I suppose I'm not. I shouldn't be one to speak on the
Interesting. So,
morality.
okay, so everything exists in the mind. Is that
No,
like,
sorry,
because
sorry.
anti-realism is a
With
pretty
respect to
broad.
morality.
Okay, got you,
Yeah,
got you. Okay.
anti-realist. Yeah. Now,
Okay.
I do subscribe to this sort of. I'm not sure if this is actually in the literature, but this sort of pragmatic realism, because I believe that's always the case for any skeptic. Like you don't, for example, if you like determinists don't act as if though they believe determinism is real, right? They sort of take this sort of pragmatic, compatibilism, right? They operate under this sort of again, this sort of pragmatic assumption that free will isn't real, but I'm going to pretend it does because otherwise I just kind of just I don't even know how you can't really operate as a skeptic, right? The skeptic, I
Yeah, yeah,
believe
yeah.
Noam Chomsky, I think he sort of called out skeptics, right? He said it was a bit of a bold sort of assertion, but he said that skeptics don't actually exist because the skeptic wouldn't last like 5 minutes in the real world.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that, I mean,
Yeah,
that is
100%.
true. Like
It's
skeptic,
yeah.
but again, I don't know if that's I don't know if that would be indicative of their sort of belief system. I don't know if that, because I mean you're it's kind of hard to make a claim about someone's epistemology, but I think that they do believe it, but they just act as if it isn't, right? Like for example, I'm an anti-realist, but I understand, if I were to see some elderly lady getting beaten on the street, I'm not just going to say, well, morality isn't real, I'm just going to keep walking on the street. No, I'm going to help her out, right? It's just, and again, you can't really fight these sort of intuitions that we have, right? I mean, irrespective of whatever sort of philosophical proposition I ascend to, I still have these sort of emotional drives that are gonna that will in some way dictate my actions. So, but yes, I am an anti-realist with respect to morality. I don't see that now. This could be due to the fact I'm agnostic, because I don't think I find any secular objective moral framework to be absolutely for lack of a better word, garbage. I just if you're not a theist and you're sort of invoking this sort of objective standard, I don't see how you can possibly argue for moral realism. I just don't.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I find all the arguments because they're all predicated on intuitions. It's almost always any argument is sort of a repackaged and a cleverly and intellectually repackaged argument from intuition. I mean, it's almost always the case. So, and I don't think any of those are convincing. I think there's a lot of sort of sufficient rebuttals against those arguments. But
yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think I just want to say one more point with regards to Noam Chomsky's point. I think what he meant was that you can't really separate the things you believe and the things you do in the world. So whatever you're trying to do in the world is going to reflect on your beliefs. So you cannot really separate them at the end of the day. So if you believe that morality is not true, and then at the same time,
but then you're acting as if though it exists. That's interesting, because Peterson brings up this point too when he tries to say that people aren't really atheists.
Exactly, it's not separable. Yeah. I think
I always found that to be an interesting question, because I think for the most part that is the case. But people may declare one thing and then they act as if they're another. For example, the sort of phenomena that we've seen of cultural Christians, right? Or right, people that claim they believe in God, but then they, that
They don't act upon it,
they
basically.
completely diverge against the entire doctrine. And the way I sort of get at this is that if God were to reveal himself to you at this very moment, your entire orientation would radically shift. I mean, if God were to reveal himself to one of these cultural Christians,
Mm-hmm.
the Bible becomes the law, right? The Bible becomes this sort of schematic framework by which you are to orient yourself, and there is no other way around that, right?
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, I do believe that behavior is a sort of reflection of your belief systems, but in other respects, I'm not so sure. I think there are beliefs you can hold that, you again, for pragmatic purposes, that you may not sort of act out. But yeah.
Yeah, I tend to, I guess, agree with Chomsky on this. I think it leaks into the beliefs at the end of the day, but I think there's another aspect to the neuroscience question, which is psychology, obviously, because I think this is, from my reading, I guess, from my limited reading when it comes to neuroscience, it's a pretty contentious topic between neuroscientists, where some agree that you should incorporate psychology, some do not really agree that you should incorporate psychology. But for me, I don't see how it's possible to not include psychology. So if you're trying to, I guess, study the visual cortex or whatever it is, it seems to me like you have to take the testimony of people, which translate to psychology at the end of the day, in order to make sense of your neuroscientific experiment.
Yeah.
So what's your conception when it comes to those opposing views? It seems to me like the more plausible one is the one that actually incorporates psychology into the neuroscientific approach. But I've read a lot of people who actually mention that one should not actually include psychology, which doesn't make sense to me. So what's your conception on this?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the discipline, right? Because neuroscience is a field that kind of grew up without a home, right? So you have these sort of if you go to like any university, if there might be a separate neuroscience department, but oftentimes it's either going to be in the psychology department or the biology department or in the biomedical engineering department. Like at the University of Oklahoma, we have neuroscience professors in the psychology department, in the biomedical engineering department, and in the biology department. It sort of depends on the research that you dive into. So a lot of neuroscience research, particularly cognitive or behavioral, does, as you touched on, necessarily invokes psychology, because it is behavior, right? That you have to sort of, you're sort of investigating the neurocorrelates of behavior or of cognition. But then there are other fields that are sort of maybe medical oriented, right? Neuropharmacology. It doesn't really require psychology, at least for the most part, right? You're sort of, or molecular or cellular, you're sort of looking at the processes of like synapses and axons and how they're communicating with one another. So in that respect, psychology really isn't needed, and it's sort of irrelevant. But as far as behavioral and cognitive go, which is the area of neuroscience that I'm particularly interested, given its interconnectedness, its ability to interconnect with law and so on. Yeah, you are right. You do have to invoke psychology to an extent, because you're taking people's word for it. You're looking at sort of the outward manifestation of behavior as a consequence of whatever sort of neurological interventions that you're doing. So yes, in that respect you do. But there are other disciplines. For example, I worked in a lab for a neuroscience lab in each of these sections, right? So I've seen how the research kind of diverges, right? So in the visual neuroscience lab, we're looking at how their behavior changes, again, as a consequence of sort of iron deficiencies and how that affects their cognition. So that is, there's definitely a heavy focus on psychology there. But when in the other lab, in the sort of biomedical engineering department, we're running sort of computational analyses on fMRI data, which you don't really need psychology for, right? You're sort of looking at the functional connectivity in the brain, how do different brain regions sort of co-fluctuate, et cetera. So in that respect, you don't need it. But yes, I do think it is absolutely necessary for cognitive and behavioral research, because what behavior is, I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Intrinsically connected with behavior. It's intrinsically connected with psychology. So in that respect, yes. So, but now there is some literature where I suppose you don't have to take people's word for it. Like there's, for example, studies on episodic memory. Right, the what, when, and where of a memory. They do it on a lot of animal models, right? You can't really take the word of a rat. You're just kind of having to observe their behavior. But again, I mean, you could easily classify that as psychology as well, because a lot of psychologists, they don't really ask the participants anything. They're just kind of observing what happens when they sort of set these specific parameters. So
I guess when it comes to isolated phenomena, you could not incorporate psychology, but when it comes to the whole of human consciousness, if you want to actually see the whole picture, it seems to me like psychology at that point becomes inextricably linked to neuroscience.
Mm.
So I guess
Well,
you
I
could
suppose in that
study.
respect, yes, but in that case, I would say that every discipline is built on top of one another, right? So physics is sort of underpinning chemistry, chemistry is underpinning biology, biology is
Yeah.
underpinning psychology, psychology is underpinning sociology. So in that respect, yes, but I suppose in a more if you're looking at a more
Pragmatic sense, I
yeah,
guess.
a more pragmatic or precise
Yeah.
sense, then yeah, you don't really need psychology. But
Yeah.
yeah, eventually the work you're doing in sort of molecular neuroscience, it will eventually will have sort of implications for human psychology down the line, right? Yeah. For example,
Mm.
fMRI is a quantum technology, right? So quantum physicists were doing this work, and eventually it sort of was able to be applicable to neuroimaging modalities, and then right that's used in behavioral research and so on. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting you mentioned the layers of abstraction such as physics, chemistry, and all these things. I think that's what actually makes consciousness difficult to understand because it has all these layers of abstraction that you cannot really reduce. So physics is really like you don't really need to scratch a lot of things in order to get to the physics of things. But when it comes to consciousness, you have to go through all those different layers of abstraction in order to understand it, which is what actually makes it really difficult to understand. So that's actually a very interesting point, I guess. So there's one point that actually came to my mind while I was, I guess, preparing for this to a certain extent.
Mhm.
I realized that a lot of the experiments when it comes to neuroscience is pretty much done on animals, so mice or whatever it is. So how do you think neuroscientists actually reconcile this fact where you're studying animals but you're trying to conclude things about the human consciousness from animals? So it seems to me like there's some kind of, I guess you could call it a gap to a certain extent. Like it seems to me like perhaps there's a lot of discussion about this or not so much.
Yeah, so there's absolutely physiological disparity between mice and humans, right? Now there is actually quite a bit of work on humans, but the non-invasive work, given the birth of sort of technologies like fMRI, EEG, these have allowed extensive human research which was not the case prior. It was a lot on animals and squids, mice, you name it, crickets,
Yep.
bats, and there's still quite a bit of research being done on them, but there is a lot. There has been this sort of explosion of research on human subjects given these non-invasive imaging methodologies. So yeah, there is plenty of studies on animal models, but there is also quite a fair amount of on human as well. At least as it pertains to sort of cognitive and behavioral, it's kind of hard to do sort of. I'm not too familiar with the sort of other disciplines. I sort of focus on cognitive and behavioral, but as far as
Mm.
pharmacological or cellular and molecular. I think those I would imagine they probably utilize a lot of animal models. I mean, animal models are used in a lot of sort of like I touched on earlier, like a lot of memory studies. They sort of manipulate rats. The thing
Yep.
is with the animal models is that again you get to invoke these sort of invasive techniques, right? So you can inject you can sort of take out part or you can inject. What are they called? Serums that sort of deteriorate parts of the brain, and you can sort of it's like a lesion study almost, right? You can sort of look
Yeah.
at when this part of the brain is missing, what happens, what is this
Exactly.
brain
Yeah.
implicated in, and then you can do a lot of things. I mean, you can do optogenetics on rats. You can sort of activate and deactivate particular neurons given using fluorescent lighting, and then see how their behavior sort of changes. And so
Mm.
the reason animal models are used is because we get to manipulate the brain quite a bit. There's almost no neuromodulation when it comes to human models, and there probably isn't any unless in certain circumstances. Like I know a professor who's doing research utilizing EEG, and he's doing research on patients with epilepsy, and there's a neurosurgeon that's going to implant an electrode in this epilepsy patient's brain, but that's incredibly rare. I mean, getting sort of these intracellular recordings of the actual brain is really rare.
Yeah.
That's another reason animal models use as well, because you get a more precise analysis of the sort of action potentials, right?
Mm.
Because if you're looking for EEG, for instance, it only looks at the cortical areas, which is like the
Yep.
outermost
Yep.
layer of the brain, and then fMRI doesn't even look at neuronal activity. It looks at changes in hemooxyglobin levels in the brain, right? It looks at
Yeah.
oxygen levels in the brain, so it doesn't even look at neuronal activity. And so again, when you look at these sort of the rats and these animal models, you get to put electrodes right in their brain and get direct activity and sort of see how it correlates with behavior. So yeah, animal models are incredibly useful, but there is an issue with sort of translational approaches.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just finished. I was going to say now there are obviously benefits because there are a lot of similarities, but then there are also a lot of differences. So, but as far as behavior and cognitive, there is quite a bit of work being done there with on human subjects. Again, given these sort of non-invasive imaging techniques that we have now. So,
Yeah, I think this actually brings a very interesting point in my mind, because I think part of the difficulty in understanding consciousness is there is one layer, which is the complexity, and then you have the ethical issues of manipulating the human brain to understand it. So it seems to me like it's two-layered, the difficulty in understanding human consciousness. So it's very interesting that people actually thought of this idea to incorporate animals, and I guess you have more leniency when it comes to experimenting on animals, but humans, you can't really go that far because, as you said, you only use non-invasive things such as fMRI and all these different things.
Even animals too. The bigger the animal, the harder it is to get it passed through international review board.
Oh, interesting.
Or the research
so
board.
mice is fine. It's very flexible, I guess. But
yeah,
then
crickets, bats, those are fine. But if you want to experiment on like cows or lions, like good luck, because the bigger the animal. Yeah, I don't know. IRB, I don't know what the acronym for, but there's this sort of the ethical review board for any and all research. So
interesting. It's a very weird metric, like size is, I guess, but size.
I would imagine it's sort of the intuition. It's probably the intuition. We feel more comfortable like planting an electrode in a cow and sort of altering its brain chemistry than we do a rat.
Yeah.
I mean, that you see that, so you see it manifest itself in the abortion argument as well, right? It's sort of hard to be, at least a lot of people it's hard to be sympathetic towards, sort of, fetus, given how small it is, and it sort of doesn't really resemble anything that we see, although that's a completely separate argument. But you see that manifest in that discussion as well, sort of the preference for size.
Exactly. Yeah. It speaks to human intuition, I guess. Like a lot of things we can't really rationalize, but at the first instance, they seem very intuitive to us, which it speaks to the consciousness, I guess, discussion. So what's your conception when it comes to, I guess, I wouldn't say really necessarily AI, but AGI? Do you think AGI, meaning the general intelligence in, I guess, computers, which is basically what a lot of people claim that it will be a point in the future where we actually build conscious machines, I guess. So do you think, from your conception, that's going to be in the near future, or from your understanding of neuroscience and all these different things, you understand that consciousness is an extremely complex phenomena, therefore it's not going to be in the AGI is not going to be in the near future. So what's your conception? And also, on top of that, how do you think AI has helped the research when it comes to neuroscience, I guess? Not necessarily the soft AI, not the computers and all these things, but I guess from a more simulating the mind perspective, do you think that helped, or not so much when it comes to research?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with AI, but if we're speaking on the sort of consciousness that can emerge from AI, well, obviously I don't believe that can emerge, given that I only believe the consciousness can emerge from the brain. So I don't believe that we'll be able to reach a point where an AI is sort of conscious. But I do believe it has been incredibly beneficial in sort of simulating like neural networks and assisting with sort of computational models. So yeah, I think AI has been incredibly beneficial with not just neuroscience research, but just any research in general. So I do think there's a place for it. And yeah, I'm not too versed in with respect to AI. So I'm not sure there's more for me to speak on.
Yeah, interesting. So what's your conception also on, I guess we could diverge into the topic of free will, which
that's a great one. I love free will.
Yeah. I guess now, since we fleshed out the neuroscience and stuff like that, I guess we can go into the more abstract layers and talk about things that are not related so much to the brain, because there's a huge gap between free will and the brain. Like, I don't think any neuroscientific research has talked about the idea of free will. I've come across only one study that talked about free will from a neuroscientific perspective. It's a study by Benjamin Leibe, I believe, which I'll probably share it with you at some point. He
Well,
spoke about.
there's quite a bit of literature indirectly. So a lot of the free will literature, or a lot of the free will sort of papers now, they do invoke a lot of sort of neuroscientific elements.
Oh, interesting.
Given this sort of, I think that there's one. For example, the reason I'm a bit familiar with this is because neurolaw, which is the career I want to go into, that's like the focal question in neurolaw is, are these criminal acts being committed as a consequence of free will or a consequence of these sort of predetermined neural pathways? So it's a pretty huge topic in the field. But yeah, a lot of research with respect to the brain has begun to sort of raise these questions on, are we free, right? How I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of debate, but as far as my stance on free will, I say we do, although I am a determinist when it comes to moral responsibility. I'm absolutely, so I don't believe as far as evil is concerned, right? Not, stealing from a grocery store or something like that. I do believe you can be, morally blamed for, but I think anything that sort of exceeds the bounds of sort of normality and sort of just, again, like anything we call heinous or collectively call evil, I do not think that there is free will in these actions. Now, that's not to say that they shouldn't be punished or anything, but for example, it kind of ties in with my perspective on law. So there's a few different perspectives you can take. There's sort of retribution, right? You sort of atone for your sins in a sense. You have rehabilitation, which is sort of, right, we can fix, we can fix them, these wrongdoers. And then you have public safety, which is the approach that that's the sort of proposition I ascend to, is that, or the framework I subscribe to, is that it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. I'm not really interested in what it is that led to this situation. If you committed the crime, you're not safe for the public, so you should be imprisoned, right? I'm not really interested in the sort of context to any degree, because again, I don't even believe that for a lot of crimes you're even responsible. Like I don't even morally condemn you for what you did, but you're not safe for the public at large, so you need to be isolated.
So it's almost like a pragmatic type of incorporation, exactly, to a certain extent.
Because I find it very difficult to ascribe, sort of attribute responsibility to these sort of people that commit these sort of higher order grievances, because I think it always comes down to these sort of different approaches, right? So, okay, so for example, if you take, let's take the sharpshooter. This one's pretty obvious and very intuitive. I'd never get any pushback on this one, but right, he had a tumor in his brain that was pushed against the VMPC, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in moral decision making. Right, so he had a tumor pressing down on that part, and he goes and kills a bunch of people. Right, so that one's pretty obvious. Okay, he had a tumor in his brain. Okay, I never get a pushback there. But I think that's only one of the many circumstances by which leads one toward committing an act of, as we would call it, evil. Right, so another one. Now this is a bit of an oversimplification, but I think that there's still plenty of merit there. Right, so if you have someone that has sort of hippocampal circuitry that's finely tuned to sort of traumatic stimuli. Right. For example, the reason why some people, two people in the army might go through the exact same event, only one gets PTSD, the other one doesn't. Clearly, there's a disparity in neurocircuitry there that causes one to develop that, and the other one doesn't. The one that does, that's going to impact their cognition and lead them to go, commit murders or whatever the case may be. Because you see that. I don't know how often that is the case, but you do see that where ex-veterans or veterans end up sort of developing PTSD and they go commit, heinous acts. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's one, and you could apply that to children raised in a traumatic home, because you often hear the argument is there. Well, okay, not everyone that has a traumatic upbringing goes on and commits crime or evil or whatever the case may be. And again, that argument may seem sufficient on the surface, but again, if you sort of delve deeper into this sort of the circuitry of it all, perhaps it's the same situation when it comes to PTSD. That child that grew up in this home with the alcoholic father might have had altered brain chemistry, and that sort of traumatic stimuli had a profound effect on their cognition, which was not the case for child B, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's a factor that's not really taken into account. And then you also have sort of cognitive susceptibility to ideological rhetoric, right? Because you can't control what you believe, right? If I were to lay out, sort of 40-point logical syllogism for why X is real or whatever, and that convinces you, that captivates you, right? You have no control over what you believe. Now, you may be able to sort of believe, or you may be able to control the actions you take prior to a belief, right? If you want to believe in the existence of God, for instance, you might expose yourself to 50 arguments for the existence of God, and if one of them convinces you, fair enough. But if none of them convince you, you can't control that, right? So you people that sort of subscribe to these sort of harmful rhetorics, maybe, I don't know, like neo-Nazi rhetoric or whatever the case may be, they might believe one thing, and they're like, okay, well, I mean, that's true, and then they sort of keep diving in further and further and further, and eventually they get to the point where they believe all of it, and then they go commit these horrible acts. Yep. But the problem there is they had no control over what they believed. So how can they be blamed for that? That doesn't seem to be within their control, right? And then you also have so you have the sort of the brain chemistry of the susceptibility. There was a few others genetic predispositions, right? So there are particular genes like the MAOA gene that are implicated in aggressive behavior. Well, and there's actually some literature that's begun to show. I was speaking with someone who actually she does research on genetics, and I believe I don't want to misspeak, but I believe she stated that not only is it the case that these genes that are implicated in sort of behavioral modulation, if you will, are, if you're exposed in a negative, if you're sort of brought up in a negative environment, it sort of augments the negative impact of the gene. But if you're raised in a positive environment, it sort of mitigates any sort of risk factors, and actually some literature has shown that it can actually sort of lead to improved behavior with respect to sort of like societal adherence or whatever the case may be. Yep. So you essentially have more optimal behavior if you're exposed in a positive environment, and if you're exposed in a negative environment, you have you can commit again, like I mentioned, you can go down a path of crime or whatever the case may be. So that would actually sort of bolster my point about how your genetic predisposition is sort of in many ways plays a large role in sort of your behavior, which can, I don't see how you're in control of that either, and I don't see how you can be morally condemned for that either if you have these sort of genetic predispositions. So you have genetics, you have neural circuitry, so all of these sort of biological idiosyncrasies or cognitive idiosyncrasies that lead one down a path of crime. And if you look at a lot of these people that commit these heinous crimes like rape or murder or whatever the case may be, you're almost always going to find one of these involved. Right now, of course, we can't run genetic studies on everyone, but I if I were a wagering man, I'd be willing to bet that a lot of these criminals, that if we don't have one of these other explanations, right, some sort of traumatic stimuli that affected their cognition, or a tumor, obviously that those are pretty rare. I'd be willing to bet that genetics probably play a large part. Or again, if you look at a lot of people, aside from if you're, I mean, this one's pretty intuitive as well, but right, psychiatric or neurological disorders, right?
Yep.
But I don't really ever receive any pushback on that. I mean, that one's pretty obvious, right? If you're a schizophrenic or if you have sort of antisocial personality disorder, well, obviously you can't really be blamed. It's just kind of how you're wired.
Yep.
But so my point here is that almost all of these factors come into play. I would be willing to wager that almost all these factors, one of these, come into play whenever an act of evil, because it's just so I don't know, abstract, or it's just so it's such a large deviation from normality. Like neither of us could ever even conceive of committing an act akin to the Holocaust, or I don't know, just rape, or just rape in general. It's just so, again, it just deviates so far from normality and the bounds of any sort of normative framework that we sort of subscribe to. I just, one of these almost have to come into play and alter the way in which you think and act and behave. So that's why I'm not, as far as evil, right? Again, if we're speaking on stealing from a grocery store, yeah, I'm sure we've all probably done that. Or if you speak from even cheating on your spouse, things like that things that happen pretty often and don't really exceed any bounds of normativity. I think, yes, you can definitely be morally judged for that. But as far as evil is concerned, yeah, I'm definitely a determinist when it comes to evil. So that sort of plays a large part in my legal stance as well when it comes to public safety. I don't believe, because I was prior to this, I did subscribe to sort of retribution, right? I was like, you need to atone for your grievances, right? You need to pay for your sins, etc. But now that sort of I've taken this sort of deterministic route, I think public safety is the most ideal candidate, because I don't think rehabilitation. You see, and at least as far as I'd be interested to see in sort of the public opinion, but as far as like legal academia is concerned, it's overwhelmingly like rehabilitation. But that's just because academia in large is just liberal in general.
Yeah,
They're very progressive, so rehabilitation is sort
especially
of
in the United States, I guess,
yes.
more
So
so. Yeah,
rehabilitation is the sort of progressive route to take when it comes to crime or law.
yeah,
And then retribution. I would be interested because in the United States, at least, the overwhelming majority of the population is liberal or progressive. But I find it interesting because when it comes to law, a lot of them tend to take a sort of retributive approach or a retributionist approach.
interesting. Yeah,
Right? He's an evil, he's a psychopath, he needs to pay for what he's done, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I would be interested to see if there was a poll on that.
yeah. They
What the outcome
implicitly
would be.
take that. I think they implicitly take that decision to a certain extent.
Mhm.
Like, yeah,
I
they
mean,
don't actually have
it
it.
also is intuitive, right? I mean, we sort of get we get riled up. We have these sort of visceral reactions to people
Yeah.
that commit these acts, and we're like, okay, they need to pay, etc. So,
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's my stance so free will. I do believe in free will, generally speaking, but as far as evil is concerned, I don't believe that there is free will there. I think it's all deterministic, and again, that's not to say they should be allowed to freely roam, but there's nothing to blame. Like there's nothing to judge there. It's just I don't know. I guess a more intuitive way to view it would be sort of like a robot. Like you design two robots. One is a sort of stand-up citizen, law-abiding citizen, and the other commits evil. You don't condemn the robot. You don't morally judge the robot. You just deactivate it or reconfigure it or whatever
Mm.
the case may be. But you don't judge or morally condemn the robot, right? Because you understand it's not in control. It doesn't have any free will. So
Yeah. I think that's actually a very interesting point of view because they're almost like I think there are 2 points I can push back with this. The first is that
absolutely.
I think society has a lot of obstacles for those people. So, for example, if you were raised in a negative, let's say, environment that made you susceptible to do crime, I think there's a lot of obstacles in front of you that you're not supposed to overcome, I guess. Like
Mm,
society would frown upon you if you do that crime. It seems to me like going and avoiding those obstacles requires agency to a certain extent because you have society frowning upon you, you have your family, you have
mm.
all these different obstacles that
There's
we
sort
have
of
towards
societal
crime.
incentives to sort of inhibit your desire.
Exactly. Not even societal, but I guess psychological, because humans, from I guess the large majority of humans, have this intuition to, I guess, do good rather than bad. So it seems to me like you have a lot of layers that should make you stop from doing that act, but like overcoming those obstacles requires some kind of agency. So it seems to me like from that perspective, yes, negative environments increase the probability of some people committing crimes more than others, but at the same time, they have the agency to repress that action, I guess. So it seems
Yeah.
to me like you could say that your conception is okay, it increases the probability, but it seems to me like you took it to the extreme when you said it's a deterministic route.
Mm.
Like, yeah, it increases the probability, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a 100% deterministic route, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I
So,
guess
so I
this is
guess
one aspect of the pushback, I guess. Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
So I guess my response to that would say I think you make a good point, but again, but if I think there's a symmetry there when it comes to like ambitious people, right? People that are industrious or high in conscientiousness that tend to be sort
Yep.
of very ambitious. There's a lot of obstacles for them, right? But they still they overcome those obstacles but I guess your argument is that there's agency. So
Exactly. Yes.
I would say that the agency's been tampered with, right? If you have these very very sort of profound or very strong inclinations or proclivities toward committing these acts, then you don't care about the obstacles. You don't you it's just something in it's just there's just impediments that are standing in your way that you sort of dismiss and deal with in order to sort of achieve your sort of superordinate aim, right? I would say that the agency has been hampered because of the proclivities or inclinations. But even if this were not the case, right? Even if your sort of hypothesis was correct, I still think that plays a part in moral responsibility. I mean, I think that if they're not playing on equal grounds, right? I mean, they have these sort of predispositions that are not equivalent to the vast majority of society, right? So I don't think that we can punish them or at least condemn them to the same extent that we do other people because they have these sort of predisposed inclinations or proclivities. And you see that a little bit in the legal system, right? The insanity defense, whatever the case may be, or if again, if someone grew up in a traumatic home, sometimes they might reduce the sentence a little bit. So you see this manifested in the legal system, but you don't really see this manifested in sort of colloquial discourse, right? You see, no matter what the case may be, they get full condemnation. But so I guess to sort of sum up, if we grant your hypothesis, I still don't think they can be judged equally, because they're not operating on equal grounds, right? They're operating with different sort of genetic predispositions. But I guess my response to that would be, I think the agency has been tampered with, given that the proclivities are not sort of set at baseline, if you will.
Yeah, I guess
so that would be my response there.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, but I think conceding to the fact that there's agency blows apart the deterministic route, I think. Like what you're saying is
I'm not conceding the agency, though. I think the agency's been tampered with. I don't think there is a sort of genuine sense of agency there, given that it's been sort of tampered with in a sense because of their predispositions.
Okay, so your point of view is that agency is not. It's not really agency to a certain extent.
Exactly.
It's almost okay. Yeah, I guess I would have to diverge from this conception, because I think the environment with which people, let's say, get raised or whatever it is, seems to me to be decoupled from the perception of people. Like, I think there's almost two layers. There's a perception which has free will. I think the free will is in the domain of perceptions, but then a lot of things that are in the environment are deterministic. Like, I don't necessarily disagree with your ideas, but I think our perception towards the environment, let's say, is, to a certain extent, we have free will to that. To a certain extent, yeah. So I think that's my point of view on this. So I guess we could also touch base on your disagreements with my my conceptualization when it comes to the video, when it comes to the problem of evil.
Problem of evil, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think this also links very well to the idea of determinism and free will, because that was, I guess, one of the points of view that we kind of had the back and forth with.
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually a great initiative that you actually told me to have a long form conversation, because
I just figured it'd be better than just kind of going back and forth on you.
Yeah, that's actually way better. Yeah. So what do you think were the points of disagreement, I guess, when it comes to my idea of, I guess, debunking the problem of evil? Yeah. Although I want to say one thing, that I kind of actually, after having a back and forth with you and all the people who actually commented on my video, which I loved so much, I kind of changed my conception on this. Okay. Like, I have the overall same stance, but I changed my route to that, I guess, debunking. Mm-hmm. So I also written an essay to, I guess, correct my points of view when it comes to the video. So you can go ahead and just lay out your points of view on why do you disagree, and then we can, I guess, discuss those points.
Well, I suppose I'd have to hear your new arguments, otherwise it'd be...
Yeah, sure. So I basically divide my arguments into two parts. The first part is that one requires, it's necessary for the bad type of evil, let's say, like people suffering and all these things, whether it's wars or whatever it is, in order to have the good type of suffering. Because when you have the bad type of suffering that you think is unnecessary, for example, whether it's wars or whatever it is, you try to avoid that bad suffering. And then by extension, you get all the things you like about the human condition. You get progress, you get human consciousness in and of itself requires suffering in order to overcome that suffering and then come out better at the other side of the spectrum, if that makes sense. So it seems to me like we require those. And by the way, sorry, I moved my hands way too much.
No worries.
So I think the things that we perceive as unnecessary or the bad type of evil is actually required for us to have consciousness in and of itself, and all the things we appreciate about the human condition or the human approach, let's say. So that's the first layer of my argument. The second layer is that I think in order to have free will, which we might disagree on, I guess, but I believe in the idea of free will and that we have free will perception. In order to have free will, it has to be the case that there is evil, because free will is choosing all the different logical outcomes from a set of, let's say, actions or outcomes. So if you actually repress let's say if you assume that you repress people from committing evil, then you don't actually have free will in the first place. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So if you actually remove part of the combinatoric, let's say, probability of outcomes, then you don't have free will anymore. You kind of contradicted the idea of free will in and of itself. So it seems to me like in order for humans to have some kind of free will or free agency, it has to be the case that there is people who commit evil, let's say. So I guess those are the two layers, and I think they kind of diverge with each other at some point, which we can link, but you can go ahead and share your conception.
Yeah. So for the first one, I think it's a valid argument. I think there's merit in that argument. I think the problem with a lot of theodicies that I take is that you're sort of providing a rationalization for the current laws governing our reality, right? You're sort of providing a rationalization for the laws as they are currently, as opposed to sort of analyzing it from a creationist perspective, like a sort of an a priori perspective, right? Before everything was created, how could you have created the world? Instead, I find a lot of theodicies tend to sort of justify the way in which the world is now and how it sort of serves to be optimal. For instance, you mentioned a lot of these sort of instrumental goods that can be brought about given suffering, and suffering is necessarily sort of invoked to bring about these goods. I mean, from an all-powerful perspective, you could just create a world in which you could derive these sort of goods that are brought about as a consequence of suffering without invoking suffering. So I think that seems to be a pretty simple adjustment there. And then as far as free will is concerned, I do believe in free will, just not in moral responsibility, but that is very relevant to what you were talking about, because you're talking about free will as it pertains to moral evil. So I think if I were to grant your worldview there that a moral responsibility does exist as far as evil is concerned, I think I think there is a situation in which you could create a world where people are free and there is no evil involved. For instance, the manner in which the world is now, God is aware of who will and who will not choose him, who will and who won't commit evil. So I don't see why he couldn't create a world as it is currently and just simply refuse to allow the creation of those who he know will not choose him or he know will commit evil. Right? So we have the world as it is right now. So people are still freely choosing him, but he just doesn't create those that don't choose him and that commit evil. Right? It's like if I'm throwing a party and I know who will and won't come, and I only invite the people who I know will come, they're still coming to the party out of their own free will, right? No one was forced them to come. I just knew who would come, so I only invited them. And I didn't waste my time inviting people who I knew wouldn't come. So I think that would be my response to that, given I sort of grant your worldview there. And then for the first one, my response would be, I think it's a good argument if God's power was limited. I think if God's power was limited, and this was sort of the only sort of manner with which he sort of orchestrated the sort of laws governing our sort of spatial temporal existence, then I think that would be a sufficient defense. But given that this is an all-powerful and all-knowing being, I would say that he could have sort of easily, any goods that you can derive from suffering or anything for that matter can easily just be altered. And yeah, so those would be my thoughts there.
Yeah, I think the first point you mentioned is pretty interesting. Like you were, I guess, speaking to the fact of the omniscience of God or the omnipotence of God to a certain extent, where God could actually will a certain outcome that would be more beneficial to the human race, I guess, from your perspective. But my counter argument to that would be, if we assume that God is omniscient or omnipotent, it seems to me like we cannot really provide alternative that we assume that would be better, if that makes sense. So if we assume that God has more knowledge than us, so he's omniscient, omnipotent, it seems to me like to say that we could assume that our alternatives is better, even though we have limited knowledge relative to God's knowledge, it seems to me like that would be a contradiction where you're kind of trying to say that, okay, I'm over and above God's omniscience or omnipotence, and I can know what the better alternative are, if that makes sense. So it seems to me like as soon as you concede to the fact that God is, for example, let's say for the sake of argument, one concedes to the fact that God is omnipotent or omniscient, at that point, you cannot really present better alternatives, I guess, given the arguments we mentioned. So it seems to me like there would be some kind of contradiction towards the idea of the omniscience of God.
Yeah, so I guess I guess there would be two ways I could approach that, because I think this is the sort of like anthropomorphic constraint that you touched on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So with that, I think there are two ways I could approach this. One, I think if I grant that, I think there's a symmetry issue. I think if we grant that God is all-knowing, if his sort of his intentionality is sort of unintelligible, I would say that there's a symmetry issue. Any theodicy that is put forth is also subject to this sort of anthropomorphic constraint, right? How could one possibly, given that this is an all-knowing being, how could we possibly attempt to rationalize this sort of omniconscious being, the intentions behind his design? It seems to be that would also be subject to this sort of anthropomorphic constraint, right? And so any critique of the manner in which sort of God designed to sort of orchestrate the world would also render any defense just sort of trivial as well, right? Our minds are sort of too inferior. And then sort of the other perspective, the other approach I could take with that was, I suppose I could say that, God's knowledge is obviously above our own. However, this seems to be something that would be easily reconcilable, I suppose. Right? It's sort of it doesn't seem to be outside of the bounds of human knowledge to sort of reconfigure the world. Although it could easily be the case that there are things that we just simply are not privy to. So, but I suppose the first one would be the major argument. There would be kind of, I mean, any defense would also be subject to this, and that kind of makes the entire conversation about the problem evil essentially pointless in a lot of respects. So I was curious what your thoughts were on there. Well, and then also I'm just curious, are you under the impression or do you sort of subscribe to the sort of best possible worlds defense, or no?
Is best possible worlds meaning?
Yeah, like this is the sort of the best possible world that God could have created, and there just happens to be suffering and et cetera, et cetera.
I guess you could say that God has created the optimal, from the omniscient perspective, God has created the optimal situation for all things in the universe, I guess. So that's my conceptualization of God's creation. And we see this with consciousness as well. Like, it seems to me like a lot of the beauty in the world seems to prove this point to a certain extent. So yeah, go ahead. You were saying?
Well, yeah, that was just what I was saying. So would you subscribe to sort of like this is the best possible world that God could have created? Is that kind of
could have created is a tricky one. I guess you could say optimal for the humankind as we are today, to a certain extent.
That's fair.
Like, we could like God could have created us another way that would have been, I guess, perhaps more optimal. But I guess given the situation that we
given the sort of state of humanity as is.
Yes,
this is the best possible world that God could have created.
Yes, given the universe and all the variables that we have.
Okay, got it.
So that's my. So I guess my point of view when it comes to your point about, like, we could basically, it's almost like a God of the gaps argument, where you could say, oh, okay, so God knows better than us, then at the end of the discussion. But I think we could kind of divide the argument into two parts to a certain extent. The first part is the whatness. Like, we can know the what's, but sometimes we cannot know the hows, if that makes sense. So us presenting alternatives, it seems to me like we're kind of speaking about the howness of things. But we could speak about the whatness, where we're not really presenting better alternatives. We're trying to understand the world, as we said. But once the humankind, let's say, tries to present alternatives when it comes to God's omniscience, that's where the problem actually emerges in my conceptualization. So it's not necessarily that we cannot understand anything that God gives us. It seems to me like there is a constrained type of approach when it comes to giving alternatives, or better alternatives than God's alternatives, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
So
I think that's an interesting point. Yeah, so just to sort of ensure that I'm interpreting your argument correctly, we're attempting to understand the world as it is, as opposed to offering alternative sort of explanations for how the world could have been, right? So
yes.
Those require sort of these two different levels of sort of, I suppose, epistemic certainty, right?
Yes. Yeah, you kind of like, we can understand the whatness, it's intelligible to a certain extent, but sometimes when you start to give alternatives, where the problem actually emerges, when you actually concede to the fact that God is omniscient. And it seems to me like proving, like, for example, the existence of a creator from first principles is possible. Like, we're not saying that everything is not possible rationally, therefore we just believe without any evidence. No. But we could actually prove a lot of things when it comes to creation. It seems to me like you could prove not the existence of God, but the existence of a creator, let's say, at least atheistic from first principles. And then as soon as you reach that level from first principles, then you could perhaps take the leap that God is omniscient. And after that, you could say that any other alternative we actually present to how the universe could have been otherwise is not irrelevant, but is almost irrelevant to God's omniscience, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So, yeah, because we understand the world as it is now, and then we can sort of offer explanations, but if we don't know any other way in which the world could have been, and thus the argument is that we don't have these. It's not within the bounds of human intellect to sort of be able to sort of assert any sort of alternative.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, of course we could to a certain extent. The idea of progress, it seems to me like we could give alternatives in our environment to a certain extent. Like, I mean, what I meant is almost like hypothetical alternatives. Like, I'm not saying that we should stay within the environment we've been born with, for example. Of course, we could invent things and all these different things. But when it comes to hypothetical alternatives of the universe, it seems to me like at that point it becomes problematic, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's, I guess, my.
That's honestly, that's honestly a good point. But I would say that, I mean, it does seem to be the case that we do have the sort of ability to create hypothetical scenarios, right? We do have the ability to create hypotheticals, and it just, I suppose that we could. So then I suppose my question would be, what if there was a way in which, because there's certainly the case that, or it is certainly the case that someone has proposed an alternative framework of the world that still is subject to the current physical laws that govern our reality, right? That do serve to be more optimal. Surely it is the case that there is a more optimal way in which the world could orchestrate itself that is still subject to the current physical laws that we understand as is now. So I'd be curious just to hear your thoughts on that. So if I were to propose some alternative explanation for how the goods that are brought about as a consequence of suffering can be brought about through alternative means that don't invoke suffering, that is still subject to the physical laws that govern our reality, that would still be within the bounds of human intellect and human reason. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point. But I think you could say that, like, for example, you could say that within the laws of physics we could remove suffering. But my point is that if you remove suffering, you would have to sacrifice all these other things you appreciate about the human condition.
But that's what I was getting at. I was getting at if there is a way in which you could sort of still sort of sustain or retain these sort of goods that things that we admire by humanity and et cetera, and sort of bring them about through alternative means that are still subject to the current sort of spatial temporal laws that govern our reality. I'm sure that there's someone that has been able to propose some sort of framework by which the reality could orchestrate itself that still keeps these goods and removes suffering. But I suppose your case is that suffering is necessary for these goods. But if it were the case, I guess.
And also my point as well is that we don't know all the goods, so we cannot really present alternatives, if that makes sense. Like, we know that, like, we don't even understand what consciousness is, if that makes sense. So it seems to me like a lot of the goods we kind of have them, but we don't actually realize them. So we cannot actually present alternatives when we don't understand the goods in and of themselves, if that makes sense.
Okay.
I think
so
we'd have to.
So are you saying that we don't understand the goods, all the goods that come about us from suffering? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying we could understand some of them or a lot of them, but we don't even understand the mechanics of all of them, if that makes sense. So we don't understand the mechanics of consciousness. So in order for us to present alternatives that would retain all these goods, we would have to understand the goods in order to propose some. So that's what I'm actually getting at, that God's omniscience understands all the variables, but we don't even know what the goods are, if that makes sense. Like, we kind of alluded to this.
Sort of a skeptical theism kind of approach, right? Like, there are sort of interconnecting goods that we just are simply not privy to. We just simply can't.
It's not even like I wouldn't say can't, but let's put it in the sense that we don't understand them as of now. Let's say, to a certain extent. So long as we don't understand all of the goods that could come out, us giving, let's say, alternatives would be to a certain extent an arrogant approach where we think we understand everything good and now we're giving alternatives. Does that make sense?
So then, don't the Odysseys attempt to assert that they understand the goods? I mean, don't a lot of the Odysseys say that there are X amount of goods that can only be brought about through Y, and Y is often suffering? Don't a lot of the Odysseys attempt to assert that they understand all the goods?
Yeah,
Or
but
are they
yeah,
just admitting some of the goods?
yeah, could you just summarize their points of view, because I haven't actually been, I guess, well versed on their perceptions about
Yeah. So I
this.
mean, just any argument from like instrumental goods, I would imagine they're attempting to assert that there are goods that are brought about through suffering. Because perhaps we may not know all the goods, but as far as they're related to suffering, a lot of the Odysseys tend to say that suffering is needed for X, suffering is needed for Y, suffering is needed for Z, and these are goods that can only be brought about through suffering.
Yeah.
So they're attempting to assert that. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
I think in some respects, because I mean, your argument, you were saying that there are goods that can only be brought about through suffering. So are you just stating that these are some of the goods, or that these are all of the goods that can be brought about through suffering?
Yeah, I'm saying that we could say that, but we cannot say that we understand the mechanics of all those goods.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Like we
Yes.
don't we can probably understand them at the surface. We can see that we have consciousness, we can see that we have all these different beauties around us, but we do not understand all the mechanics with which they arose, let's say. Therefore, giving any alternatives would be an arrogant position, because how could you know that you could give rise to those goods by removing the bads when you don't actually understand the goods in the first place when it comes to their specific mechanics, if that makes sense? So I'm not saying that we don't understand them at all, but what I'm saying is that the intricacies with which those goods actually emerge, such as consciousness, I keep bringing this example up, but I think it's very relevant. We don't really understand any of its mechanics or its specific howness. Therefore, any alternatives would be irrelevant, in my opinion. Yeah.
Interesting. But aren't you attempting to assert some sort of mechanistic understanding, given that you state that these are instrumental goods through suffering?
Yeah, sure. We could have some kind of mechanistic understanding, but what I'm saying is that all of the variables are not in our hands, and we cannot.
I guess the question I would ask then, in order to push back, is that if we don't understand all the mechanistic sort of underpinnings that sort of give rise to these goods, then how can we sort of assert with a sort of high level of probabilistic certainty that suffering is necessary to bring about these goods, if we don't understand all the sort of mechanistic underpinnings?
Sure, yes. But what I'm saying is that there's a difference between what we see and our explanations of those things. So we understand what we see. We understand that all of these things are goods, but we do not necessarily understand the mechanisms that gave rise to those things, if that makes sense.
But that's what I was touching on, right? Because I think your defense for the problem of evil was saying that suffering is necessary for these goods to emerge. So is that not a mechanistic explanation? That's what
to a certain, not necessarily, because what I'm saying is that, okay, so I look at this omniscient God and I say that he gave rise to all these outcomes. I see them as good, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually necessarily saying that I know all the mechanisms, if that makes sense. What I'm saying is that I'm kind of referring to God's omniscience and saying that God gave rise to all these goods. Therefore, we have to assume, given that we do not know the mechanisms, we have to assume that those things are necessary. Does that make sense?
Okay. So I thought you were providing a sort of mechanistic explanation for how these things are brought about. You're just providing a sort of a rational assumption on how these things are brought about.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
I still think there's a symmetry though, because couldn't I just provide a sort of it's not, I suppose it's not an analogous, but I mean I suppose that alternatives that are still subject to the current laws of reality, those could also be sort of, I mean, in many respects those are assumptions as well. Those are sort of assumptions on how, like, I'm assuming the world could be this way given reality orchestrates itself in this manner, and thus if I sort of rearrange the variables or rearrange the rules given my limited understanding, I'm assuming that we could create an alternative. And so it seems to be just as rational as any theodicy.
So I mean, like the other way around is as rational.
I would imagine, right? Because it's still an assumption, given, like, they're not sort of asserting anything. It's just an assumption given the sort of physical laws that they understand, and they're not sort of changing anything about them. They're just sort of rearranging the variables to sort of provide an alternative framework in the same way that a lot of theodicies are interpreting the variables to provide a framework, right? Because theodicies are interpreting the framework, sort of critiques or arguments for the problem of evil are attempting to sort of, and they also interpret the variables, and they're attempting to sort of interpret another manner by which they could sort of have positioned themselves, but not sort of changing the rules sort of a priori.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would the problem with it being symmetrical is that it would contradict the omniscience of God. That's the thing. Because if you flip it around and say that there could be a better alternative, then you're saying that my, let's say, knowledge is better than God's omniscience by necessity, if you think about it.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that this is the best possible world. Oh, you did mention that earlier, huh? Okay, that's interesting because I guess that sort of ties into your argument. In other theodicies, they don't state that this is the best possible world that God could have made. They're just providing rationalization for how it is currently. But since you're operating under the assumption that this is the best possible world given the
yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
That's why. Okay, that's where the disparity was with our discussion there, is because you were sort of granting that. You're granting that, whereas a lot of theodicies don't grant that. A lot of theodicies. Okay, interesting. So you're just interpreting the world as it is now under the belief that this is the best possible way in which it could have sort of been designed.
Yeah, given the conditions that we're operating under. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So then interesting. So I think this is probably just a point where we're gonna have a divergence here, because I do believe that God could have created a more optimal world. And then so I'm curious to your thoughts. Didn't he already create a more optimal world for humanity in Genesis? Curious your thoughts there.
In what sense? I'm not very well versed with the Bible to a certain extent, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah. But do you have like a specific, I guess, verse or something? I can actually go back to read it. I'm very interested.
Well, in Genesis, right, the Garden of Eden is this sort of place where there's no, at least I believe, there's no suffering, and there's no evil, right? Before Adam and Eve bit from the fruit of good and evil, there was no good and evil. Right, there was just peace. They had, there's abundance of fruit anywhere. There was no illness. There was no sickness. That seems to be an optimal world for humankind, which was already created before the world that we see now, after they bit the fruit and then the fall of man, etc. So it seems to be the case that God had already created a world that'd be more suitable for humans, that would sort of mitigate suffering. But you said that you weren't too familiar with Genesis, so we don't have to sort of
but I guess one rebuttal that the Christians could give is that they would say that this life is a test to a certain extent. So God is giving us this life as a test. So from that perspective, you could say that it's God's will that he willed that we would actually live in this world and have all the things we have to a certain extent. So I guess
I would push back on that, but I mean, I don't want you to have to like play as an apologist. So
by the way, I don't subscribe to Christianity. I'm actually a Muslim.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
So I subscribe to the Islamic, I guess, type of theology.
I'm not too familiar with Islam, so I suppose I wouldn't. I suppose I couldn't go into any specifics. We could just stick on the more abstract depiction.
Sure.
Interesting.
Sure thing. Sure. So I wanted to actually touch base on the idea of, and by the way, I would actually recommend, if you read the essay, I'll send it to you. I'll share it to you today. I think it has a more, I would say, well structured, because I think writing actually is more clear to a certain extent. You can have your sentences. Yeah. So sure, I'll share it with you today. So I actually wanted to touch base on the idea of philosophy. So what do you think is the relevance of, I guess we could diverge from the conception of, or the discussion of free will, and we can talk about philosophy. So how relevant is philosophy for you when it comes to neuroscience? Do you think one has to do philosophy in order to make sense of neuroscience, or is that not very much necessary?
Interesting. Yeah, so I'm certainly not a sort of anti-philosophy. You see a lot of, engineers or scientists say, they say philosophy is useless. I actually think philosophy should be mandatory in all educational systems. I think philosophy is absolutely pivotal in sort of navigating your sort of and navigating yourself through the world, right? I mean, I think philosophy is sort of forces us to come about there, sort of create these sort of higher resolution descriptive properties embedded within our sort of categorical frameworks, right? I mean, everything that we know, all of the anything that we believe in, and all of these conceptual truths are predicated on philosophical deliberation, right? I think
Yeah.
philosophy is an absolute necessity. Now, as far as its sort of pragmatism goes in the natural sciences, no, I don't think philosophy is necessary. Really, is in order to sort of conduct scientific experiments. But as far as sort of just navigating the world, I think it is absolutely necessary for all the social sciences. I think philosophy is absolutely necessary because a lot of the social sciences tend to have implications for ethics, for metaphysics, for epistemology. These are all philosophical topics in nature. And I think the society would simply, as a whole, would operate better if we had philosophical understandings or backgrounds. I mean, the entire, again, not to sort of circle back, but the entire abortion argument is an argument of ethics. And there are often people talking past each other. Like a lot of the pro-abortion arguments are arguments that don't stem from the actual issue in itself, right? The right to life. You often see these external variables getting brought into play, but the argument is about a right to life. But a lot of people don't even know that they're arguing for that, and a lot of people just are just in a screaming match. And there are just so many other domains of sort of discussion or areas of sort of discussion where people are engaging in philosophical deliberation or this sort of unknown form of dialectic. And in order to sort of be able to sort of engage in that properly, you need to have some sort of philosophical background. So I think philosophy is absolutely essential and is necessary. And I would say that that is necessarily the case that it is necessary because it is an investigation into human existence. It is
exactly.
There is no philosophy without human existence. And a lot of the frameworks that we see, and that's also why I like law quite a bit, is because it's in many respects it's applied philosophy, right? I mean, we need a high resolution description on what this is, right? The philosophers might be discussing, well, what is free will, what is justice? Well, in the law, they need an answer, right? What is X? What is Y? And these things are going to set the precedent for how society conducts itself. And then you're constantly making arguments in the courtroom, right? And that's exactly what philosophers are doing. Here's my 40-point syllogism. Now, they might not be laying out, syllogisms in the courtroom. There's a lot of sort of intuition pumping with the jury manipulation and so on. But in principle, our court systems, which have the most power because they control everything, right? They are they enforce these rules that have been laid out. So I take a hard I push back hard against anyone that sort of claims that philosophy is just intellectual trivialities or whatever the case may be. So no,
Even
I absolutely.
the mother of all ironies that saying that philosophy is not good is actually a philosophy in and of itself. So it seems to me like
It
they
is.
would contradict
It
themselves
is. It's funny.
as soon as they say that they mention that claim. But I guess I think those people who claim that philosophy is not relevant do not really think about truth when they're saying their claim. I think they're thinking more of pragmatic, I guess, type of.
Yeah, no, a lot of these sort of conceptualizations that they have they're operating under these sort of intuitive conceptualizations, right?
Yes.
If you look at, for example, like you mentioned, like truth, people have a very intuitive and vague understanding of truth, and that's how they sort of operate with the world. And in a lot of sense, as you touched on, that is sort of necessary or in a sort of pragmatic sense, right?
Yep. So I wanted to I guess we could touch base on the first person versus the third person. Do you think at the end of the day, I guess we touched base on this on the neuroscience discussion, but I would love to hear your perspective on this because I've been kind of thinking about this. So do you think the first person, like for example, emotions and all these different things are actually reducible through third person mechanisms such as science? Or do you think they're kind of operating on different domains? So this is a more explicit version of the prior question I asked you in the beginning. So do you think they're actually separable, like the third person cannot actually reduce the first person and vice versa? Or do you think they're not really separable at the end of the day and the first person could be at the end of the day reduced through the third person?
Yes, I suppose it depends on the lens through which you're looking at it, right? I mean, clearly phenomenology is not, it's intrinsically not third person, right? It is your subjective experience, right? You cannot possibly sort of experience what another experiences. It's just not possible. So in that sense, no, I think phenomenology just is necessarily separate from
a different domain.
It's just from any sort of third person analysis. Now, the mechanisms underpinning that sort of whatever phenomenology that you're investigating, I do think you can reduce it down to the third person, right? You can sort of, you might not understand what it's like to lose a child, but you can interpret the sort of the responses in the amygdala, right? And that's sort of causing that response, right, in the brain. You may not be able to sort of understand, again, what you may not be able to understand what it's like to be led down a path of crime, but you can still understand the mechanisms that led to the crime, right? So
Yeah.
I think it sort of depends on the lens by which you look at it. If you're looking at it by this sort of subjective experience, then no, there's no way you could possibly reduce that to some sort of third person analysis, and that is in its own sort of domain. So I guess it kind of just depends on the way in which you look at it.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting, because I've been thinking about the fact that with neuroscience, I guess we almost discovered the similarities between people, but we haven't discovered the differences, if that makes sense. So we discovered.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Absolutely.
Yeah, we discovered like the nerves or the neurons for taste, but we do not know why a specific human loves bananas, for instance. So it seems to me like we're operating at some kind of gap where we're discovering the similarities between humans and species in general, but we're kind of moving away from the differences, and we're leaving it at all, like, I guess, separate domain, because it's very difficult to actually tap into, as you mentioned.
That's actually Sam Harris kind of touches on these sort of idiosyncrasies that we have, just sort of a priori, like a desire for bananas or a desire for chocolate ice cream.
Yeah.
He tries to argue that those are inexplicable and that those are sort of set, again, like I said, a priori, and that sort of.
Oh wow, interesting. So he says that it's not explicit,
because like you can't control what you want, and your want is serves as the sort of causal contributors into your subsequent actions, right? If I can't control that I like chocolate, that I prefer bananas over apples, and that's going to control when I go to the grocery store that I'm going to buy bananas over apples, and so Sam Harris tries to argue that that's outside of your free will, right? Because you can't control.
Interesting. So does he mention that we cannot really explain it through science as well, or is his conception that it's already predetermined and that's it?
I'm not sure, but okay. he does argue that it is like predetermined, in that because you can't control it, that it is you're not free, right? For in the same respect that a lot of your actions are predicated on desires that you have that were not in your control, right? You didn't control that you like philosophy, you do, and that led to you reading and having this discussion right now. So, and so that he makes a case that that because of that you're not really free. But I don't buy into that, because I think you sort of descend to this sort of libertarian free will, which I don't think is even logically possible, to be able to control everything you want under any possible circumstance. I don't even know how that could even work. I'm not sure how the.
Yeah, I guess we also have like the obvious rebuttal to the full libertarian type of approach is that
there's still different possibilities within these sort of limited capacities. At least that's my take on it, is that even if I have these sort of preset inclinations or proclivities, I still have options within those proclivities, right? Like I can, for example, if I'm a very if I love the arts, I have a wide selection of the arts with which to choose from. I can choose whether or not to sort of go to art school or not, etc. So I think there are options within these sort of a priori these desires that we have in ourselves.
Yeah, but I think there are also other things that are non-negotiable. So, for example, the human drive for example, sexual intercourse is probably something that's not up for discussion.
Yes,
so It seems to me like there are things that are actually set in stone. It seems to me that way. But I guess from that perspective, I diverge from Sam Harris's point of view, because, as I said, I think that we could change our perceptions of the world, not necessarily the things that give rise to those things, but we could change our perceptions to a certain extent. So, yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting point. So do you have any, like, I guess, final thoughts, remarks, anything?
No, I didn't have any thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Absolutely. You as well.
Thank you.